system, and that affects behavior.
That dealing also correct against na rizigi ane once a malaya kuge shuchen correct to give meta ane tela tene and then as you show your Juepalaya shuchen correct to give metu contest giants.
And we're going to start with the behavior so that you can see how things have changed and how things can change in different types of animals.
That tamputing at Sushin Guzki is the take up Sungasugi Shute, Samche Mando Nala Shute, Kandasan Jiru, but on Kandasan Jirgu, but in Mutajays.
So we're going to start with some principles that you went over in biology, but start to apply those to some of the neuroscience that we're talking about today. So remember natural selection from biology. You've got lots of organisms, individuals in a population.
And
So there are more individuals than you need to keep the species going. And then different individuals have different individual traits. So that some might be able to survive and reproduce better than others. And those individual differences are passed on to offspring. So those that have those traits and pass them on to their offspring and get those traits from their parents are more likely to survive and reproduce. And they'll pass on those traits that help them to survive and reproduce. So there are lots of examples of behavioral and physiological adaptation, and these are changes that occur as a result of life circumstances. So as an example of a physiological change, in a person, in an individual, you might have a physiologic change with a challenge, maybe hiking up a mountain. If you have a population that lives in a certain place, like up in the mountains, they may get these physiological adaptations to help them to better deal with less oxygen that's up in the high elevations of mountains.
suni chiagi ani tunju ti the ta kusu niya the baina ya cholong te shira me baina baina suni chi thya gi tunju ti the gures.
You can see changes in behavior as well. So some physiological adaptation examples are in animals that might be climbers, they have claws. In animals that might swim, they have webbed feet.
Ta pisha chapana ga su so chana ta ba ba na ro so cha de shin dong dang tam te ga telen za ne tin da gun ne tin da ba na kusula dermo yo pa che ani chu ge ni ge sam che tin da yo pa ba nga la se tam ba nga wa ga la pa ga paro zumbu go paro la ya sha yo sa chi ro wa o tin da ge ani kusula tin je the yo res.
They might have scales to protect them or fur that helps them to keep warm.
Then I think as a kusu soncho che nya so system bala nya gang la yo chu so ro chi to ka o te ri ta ni shen den ba no kusu ani chi tombu nya che te zu bo ga la pu yo ba de yo res.
The same sorts of things can apply to the nervous system and how the nervous system develops.
Da di ge ne tan de ga su wan sa ma la ya chap ki yo res wan sa ma la chap ma to wan sa ma la ge ko tun ju kan da ru chi yo ba te ta chap res.
And with the nervous system changes, you may not just see physiological adaptation, but also behavioral changes because the neurons and their connections are going to affect the behavior that you see.
That this tambala ya tinda do ge wansa ge mala tela jiro tela tene te ani kasugurita ngasu ge zupula ya jiro thebatsa mai barwa ngasu ge shichola ya jiro the ge yore sticker sana wansa mala na ne kuta jewa ta da tong tong tela jiro the ge yorwa o tela tele na shichola jiro the ngores.
So examples in animals might be animals that hibernate in the wintertime to conserve their energy resources, or animals that migrate to avoid the really cold weather and go to where there's food.
Ta asu samchen na ta ba na ko samchen khashi su ni ba de nya chak che ga che te gung kha nye go yor wa gung kha da kha shi ran ye de ge samchen de na yor ta chung go res na shen da ba na ko gung kha ga nam shi tang mo tang ya ka nam shi chau di ye ge che te ya sa che jen da la ni pu sa la ya ni pu go yor sa che jen ba la ni pu go yor wa da ta chung go res.
They may develop behavioral hunting strategies, or in the case of humans, technology that they can use.
Da ya samchen ba na ko zu chi ga su su ge sa te ngong gu ro sa ma te ngong gu ro ngwe go ngon se te ngon je ga ge se te che an do ta ani shen da ga su mi ba na do mi la chom ba na ga su trik chi go ro tu ge ni ti tra ge ni tan chung go res.
Anything that occurs in biology is going to be dependent on evolution.
Ta tanda jingwi ge na ne kar chung yo ba cha ma ani ti ga sa phenju la tengu phenju la ro le res.
How these genes are changing over time and how they are interacting is what helps to make different organisms different in different ways and affects how we act and how we look and how we interact.
Da de do ge juan do de ten de te ani ko jingi na su pa te kan do pa ko jen ta man do kan do yo pa nga su ba na nga su ge te do tan da ge ni tan do kari chi ni ba ta nga su ge chi tan chi ba na de do chi gu nu gu jin ses chi war wa de ta de se jag yo res.
And these genes are found in living things across the board, including things like bananas.
Da de do ge ri te nga su ge tan jamla ga la yo pe ge chi den sa ma ga na na yo res ani thana tan de nga la do nga la on de na na yo res.
Now obviously bananas don't have a brain or a nervous system.
Da de nga la de la ya khula le pa yo ma de tina sing ge wan sa ma la yo ma res.
But they do share the same fundamental structure of DNA that is used for brains and nervous systems in us.
De imbai na yang ko la ya tanda ka sanga su ge lepa ta wan sa mal tribia ge jissa ge ta rizgi ge tripcha chi gorwa de tanda de imbai na de ngala la yang yo res.
the building blocks, not the genes themselves.
No, rigzi khurang sagi yo mares, rigzi ki tipcha. What did you pay yours?
So the order of those building blocks is similar with us and bananas for 50% of those pieces of DNA.
Hanta tanda disha bana tanda digi ku rigzi ki tipcha te ngasu ngala tami la dru bana jacha ngachu chikin res.
As we get closer to organisms that are more related to us evolutionary, like chimpanzees, that number of shared genes goes way up.
Hanta ngasu ta kasugre ngasu ta thumongo meu dewa yo chugar wada ngasu ta dewa yo chugi social ta bana nyam te dru bana ngasu le thumondo yo pigir rigzi ki tipcha chigorwa te gi jacha ki te thumbu chagres.
And that's one of the reasons that if you look at a brain of a chimpanzee and a brain of a human, they're different, but they look very similar compared to, say, a rat brain.
This tambala ko no is not wrong as meet tan chimpanzee lepala taba imbaina, meet tan chimpanzee lepati mandasa or the imbaina ku mandas yang agenda gi lepata drubai bana pisashana tsitsige lepata miguel lepata druata chacha bana miguel lepata ni chimpanzee lepata drubai bana ku gi chungcha ti shucho yores.
Because they have about 98.8% similarity in their DNA.
That is the Mita chimpanzee parula ya cook Rizigwa, DNA, Jacha Kuchets are good in that race.
And you and I and our brains and our nervous systems look very similar, in part because we share 99.9% of DNA.
Ngatsuga baroge lepata wansamala nala tapa imbaina aniko kasugre pe dawyo res ta dawyo pajun senchika res na ngatsuge DNA ge chongchate jache guchagres.
Now, I want to say this now because I think it's really important. You'll remember when we talked about the genes earlier, it's not just the genes, but the environment as well, and how those two interact.
Chisu yangshi tensu chitanga yin singela she yores tanda ngasuge chigo dendawla shukshin thaya te rigzi tsamaimba ne ngasu nisagi khoi kiyong ko shukshin thaya yores.
And these differences might have large numbers of brain proteins and brain genes that are different between the species. So just because we share this much doesn't mean that our nervous system should be that close.
Delata bana ko ngasu mita yana mita chimpanzee druba bana ko jacha sele chepra shita mdwa imbaina yan delatene detan dinado chepra mes tambalata chitangina chepra shita yoch mare tina samaya yo mare sta detalatene det rigzin detalatene detanga su gtzi tukku orwata this tambala chepra hipo chonchon delatene det trip ge tzi tin bete yon ko chepra mando orwa o tinda insgres.
But certainly they'll be closer between us and chimpanzees than, say, us and rats.
That is tambalaya ngasuta chimpanzee ke paruge ta chicken dachuchi orwata dawachi orwati ngasuta tsitsilin dawale beti kro choyo res dawicha choyo res.
And all of the organisms are using the same building blocks of DNA.
Da ani ngasuta chimin samage jesa ke DNA te chikpa peche tangres.
So genes don't directly affect behavior, but they do have influence on the behaviors that we see in animals, including ourselves.
Da tanda ngasuge rigzige kesishon tambala rigzige ngasuge shishute thekar tingmares ro imai na yang khu kari chigres na ani ti karsa shukche tegres ngasuge ta chig shisho kanda no chigta maten tilaya rigzige shukche tegres.
So the DNA that your mother and father gave to you is going to influence the types of things that you might do, but it doesn't control the things that you might do.
hanta danda nga sula phamali chongwi ge rigzi chigorwa ta DNA chigorwa tege ane nga su ge chi shisho tela ya thaker ge karsu gore tangjin chiala so pate yung kumaris imba na nga su ge shisho kare dro chi ta maten tela ya shuchen to gres.
And those genes will directly contribute to the development of major brain systems in our bodies to create all kinds of different proteins that those brain structures will use.
Hanta tanda de karchigre sistambala ya tanda ge rigzi phamala chongwi ge rigzi chigorwa ta rigzi tege nga su ge lepa ge malana so patreber chiela ya ne ko ramdos chigre ste kanda no chigre se nga su ge lepa ge peshe tanga ge chi tje na so pa chi ku ge rigzi tene tukpu yarwa tila tene chungores.
There's always going to be an interaction between the genes and the environment.
Hanta nga su ge rigzi tang khoi ni ge parola ya ti tok ko dawa chi yores phandelam chi ye pares.
For instance, in songbirds, they have an area of the brain that's involved in producing the song that they sing. But that happens at a certain environmental time point, in a certain season.
Hanta pecha shabat mana ko tu tanga su ge te shetan ni shu siguro ta ke nyambu to ni chu imba na ku su gale pag na kare ore sena ni she siguro ta ku su ge sha ke nyambu to ga te tan do pe gale pa cha shi chi ore sta te kangen to ore sena ku su ge she ta ma ta te wa ke nyambu do ma do te ane nga su ge khoi gi la ra le gres te kap su khoi se stambala ya namti ma ro chi kap su kurang ge she ta te ngores.
And their brain changes during that season, so that you have, say, growth in the memory areas in order to help them in the production of the song and the remembrance of the song.
Hanta te stambala ya tanda te kapsu ko titsiti ke kapsu jitong titsiti ke kapsu ko gele pala yang juan du yo res lepe ki chashirwa ta pisha sha pa na tanda ge tempa sakuro tempa sakute ku chichirin ru sarchi chi de te ani ku ge da shete tangya la ya jang ya tre ani tina senge shete ta tempa su as gorwa te ta shete ani ku ge tempi sakute chirin du yo res.
So it's exactly the same genes, but acting differently at different times.
Takula rigzi dene ko tikatham chete yo pati chik pares imba na ko ge chi shawa shetan te tismando la lika chetamando ajungu la chigores
Based on the environment.
te garila ragli system bala yo khorgila ragli res.
There are lots and lots of examples of animals where genes very directly can affect behavior, and then examples where the environment plays a really big role in affecting behavior.
Ta ngasu ge rigzi ge ani samching ge shishutela ya shichentu yo pag pisuna namang pa yo res timsene shenda imbana ngasu khoi ke ya samching ge shishula pe ko shichentu ge ni tantna yo res.
And this is something we'll return to again when we talk about some of the nervous system. We have genes in the environment having an impact on the proteins that are made, and then those proteins having an impact on sensory, motor, and neural structures, and those will have an impact on the behavior.
Ta ta de ta ba imbana su ke ngobu de ta ba imbana wa nga su rigzi tang khori la tene de te nga su ke tzi kan no treatment ta tzi te la tene de te nga su ke wang sur tang ku chu ne wang sa ge akarsa wang sa ge chako chu gorwa tzu la ya ne shi chen te la tene de te nga su ke shi la ya shi chen te ngores.
And an example of that would be Galapagos tortoises.
Ta tanda dina do ge pesante gare system bala Galapagos ge gala yo pi ge rubeteres.
Galapagos tortoises, based on the temperature that their eggs are at while they're developing, will become male if the temperature is very hot, or female if they're very cold. So it's exactly the same genes, but what determines whether they will be male or female is the temperature that the eggs are at.
Tanda de Galapagos gala yo pi ge rube kusula chemba imbana rube te chibi kapse ko pho jugre mo jugre se te ko rube ge gunga te suvi kapse wa twechela ragle ge restra ta twechela rale ba te kapse shige imbana ko rigziti shikpa res pumolan Germanjiti, Gumati Suvi Capsic Trisella Ralligoris, the Trisset Sawi Opina, Pula Jurata, Trisset Choi Opina, Tawa Opina, and the Mula Jurgris.
So temperature is affecting how these genes express their proteins.
That is Tambalaya, and it Triseti, and a Koge Casugata, Rizit the Kandanuchi, Moma Montilla, Chaperzuris.
There's also a distinction between all of your genes, your genotype, and the things that you express, your phenotype.
That other day, Kasanga Rizig Tripchach or a Rizig Tripchasna, Rizig Courage, you met on a Rizig Monam system, well, a Rizig Kandasushi, no Mangon Sach, or a Tik Perlaya Caprioris.
So you could have exactly the same genes as a twin brother, but you'll look just a little bit different because of those interactions between genes and environment and those genes that get expressed in each of you.
That under the Chera and a Kasugre, Cheranga Semar, what Sema Pinjat and Yam Rizig Chanish, Pachichan Yopa Banaya, and a Corita, Chicaneta Mompuchila and the data, and a Rizig Tripchat, you go. Chingoma Latin data, and a Chilokanamba Telaya, and a Capertis Yoganiston Yungores.
So the behaviors that we inherit from our parents, from our moms and dads, is a balance between giving structure so that we can behave in a way that will work well for us, and flexibility so that as the environment is changing, we can change with that.
Tampotelaya ngasuge shishu chik tangu gorwa shishu chik tangu alaya ta dekas chikose gorkula dom da uchi gugu yorwa re mare o tita dom chik tita ane sam ne ngasu khori mandawala yon stambala telaya kurayang tunni yon kuchi chigugu yorwa tanda dekas nyen chik se tela gugu yorwa kolaya tis nyembu gugu yorwa khoi ta tambige on this tambalaya diniga parolaya ku tunyam chik jinzi chigu yores.
So given that, what types of behaviors can you think of that would be heritable, that we would inherit from our parents, maybe because they're super important for us to survive?
This tambalaya sichuchigora sichungaso pamali jinjunchunga sichugi pisan kariyores jesu kari samlo tantkundu picha shapaina ngatsu sunila te ngior te kuwigi sichota usana. We have a couple of answers, one saying breathe in and breathe out, and one saying like reflexes, one we touch hot surface, just reflex and just bring it back, and also saying walk on 2 feet, standing up and walking on 2 feet.
Yeah, those are good ones. Those are things that are going to be really important for us. And we can modify some of those, like breathing. We can breathe slower or breathe faster. But if we're not breathing, we're not going to make it. There are other traits that might not seem so important for survival and reproduction that also have heritability. In some cases, we can see why it's really important that we would be able to inherit that behavior. In other cases, it might not be quite so clear.
The Chansala Yatinado Junzin Chias Gurata, Rapching Chila Junzin Tayagate, Jinsenting Asuka Hak, Lilo Hakuataya, Kapkalaya Junsen Lilo Hamakoat in the Yores.
Part of that might be because if we have a set of DNA, did you come up?
Yeah,
Let's say I'm a gene on the DNA, and he's a gene on the DNA, and he's a gene on the DNA. And he is really important for our survival. So he is going to be selected for in natural selection to make sure that we survive. Because we are close on the genome to him, when a copy gets made of him, our copies get made as well.
Ani tandaga rigzi phasuk rigzi te laya ani ko ge ta kasukra pershichi kapsar wa pershichi kapsar ani ngaran ji rigzi te yan dos pershichi shag yores ko tan than yu pichane.
So this can allow certain genes to follow along with a gene that's selected for.
This tambalaya ani ko da demti chiwi ge rigzi te tan yamtu ne rigzi jenda te yan ko nyamtun duga tinda yores.
Because they are very physically close.
Te kora touching aso linkam ko tane banarwa kora thachan thanyu yo cha nyamte ko precision ru yores.
There's an experiment that has been going on for a really, really long time in Russia.
Da Russia la ya ani ti kor la ya nyamshi chi ta tin rangpola rutan roshin bares.
With foxes. Do you know what a fox is before I go too far? So these types of foxes don't like humans, mostly. But what they've done is they've looked for the foxes that are willing to get kind of close to humans. And they've had those foxes in a captive environment where they only mate with each other.
Tanda kusuga delaya oamoga richi yores, oamoga riti sone milaya chune maganya tindaroa, milaya chune maganya tinda yores. That is tambala kusukar chigoresena, omo tezon, and is shenda yanko, meet on this tanyu yoni, mila this ganyas guro, oamo, tenado yon de tane, kurani parlaya, and it tikar sabun digichi, the pushi, chipechi chiga, nitantige, shimping the drugores.
Picking the ones each generation that are more likely to be able to get close and hang out near people. This domestication that you might see in lots of different animals, especially farm animals that we've raised and kept for a long time, led to foxes that acted more like dogs, that went with humans, that would go close to humans and interact with humans in ways that wild foxes would not. That was interesting, but not that surprising. What was surprising was, in addition to developing the behaviors where they would be with those people more, they also, instead of having upright ears, got floppy ears like dogs.
Ane kola mita nyamte junong pon drichi tako mila tanyu yon tan nyamte ne ko ge anjo chiwarwa anjo te ngoma bana ya tong chi de go srdowa Neku millennium to draw chigi kala kugi anjote mankor energy de tan kigi anjonaji chayores.
And spots like you sometimes see on dogs on their fur.
Tina jing chan samala chizu kim bana kigi chigu ya kuga ta bu gangla ya ane nakta kartina yoro twachi yorwa.
These were not things they were selecting for. They were just selecting for the foxes that would more likely be close to humans. But those things changed too.
Tata de kapsa imbana ngaso ge cheshi mampu chi dam yo mares. Kusu cheshi tampu kari dam resis tambala mitan tanyu daya ge chapsi cheshi te dam ga yorwa. Imbana ya jenda te ta kunyam te chong yores.
So sometimes it might be because a gene is close to another gene that's being selected for.
That's something like a karchigores and I rigzi taiko and them to chive rigzi te tanela yo big rigzi anko mankore kasugre takoge rigziti ngoyongures.
And other times it might be because of the way the genes interact. Maybe a gene that they selected for has an effect on two genes, one that makes a behavior that is more like getting close to humans, and another set of genes that affect the coloration of the spots on the body.
Ta chiche ba imbana kusugan dam to chive ge rigzi te ge and shuchi mando atenda te batina sibaris wa kuge damya te ta kuge ta mitan thanyu chia ge cheshiti dambarwa ta imbana titan de rigzi te dam stambala ya kuge ku shuchi ni gal hai chorwa shuchi ni gal hai stambala tamputi la ya kuge mit ta rigzi ti ngona mani ga shuchi te ta tamputi la ya mitan thanyu de ge shuchi la ya te bache nywa te la ya nga su kuge zpu gang la ya khitan da we ge ni ku karthi ta marthi nakthi wa chorwa o ti wa la ya chente batinda ing sigres is a question.
Yes, Colton.
You have mentioned about this fox, and we have seen that even at like cubs, like tiger cubs, if they rest in a family like with the humans, they become really friendly with the human beings. So in that case, not only tiger cubs, also fox and other wild animals, they become really friendly with the human beings. But you have mentioned that is because of the gene and the DNA or gene expression in the case of this fox. So in that two different cases, how do you differentiate? One is because of gene expression, or one is because of the environment that those cubs rest up?
In both cases, it's almost always going to be genes and environment, not one or the other.
Tadanda gera so the kapsa neta ni tadaga neta tinado ni sha imba na ane ko kasugre ko ge lai shukshen the ko ge shishola shukshen the rigje tang khori ni chare istima to pege rigje chipu tang khori chipu re se te yong mare san cha ge shukshen the ki ores.
So obviously you can have a big evolutionary advantage having genes that heavily influence behavior, because if a certain behavior helps you to survive and reproduce and make new offspring, if that's heritable, you can pass that on to your offspring and they have a better chance of surviving and passing those things on.
Tata diredo imbana ngasu rizigi tenirwa ani penjir tan devi ko kipente chambu yo pa imbana advan kipen chambu yo pa imbana de ani susu la yo pa kasda na susu ge ta pugi chi kar sagora junje rap chmatela ya ko ge dus jitro chigi yores.
What's the disadvantage to that?
That diredo imbana tila ya chongari yores. 아하. 양식 개체 무슨 다.
Wild animal the neural
Yeah. In the, for instance, for this case, for the example that we have given about the fox, the wild animal may become less and extinct in the wild.
Yeah, so the environment may change, and it won't help that particular animal that's got that inherited gene. And so having good environmental influence can allow more behavioral flexibility.
That is Tambalaya, Kugi Kasur, Kogilatane Kasur, the Kogilatane Kushula, Shambutegres, Shambutegres, the Kating Asula Nisaga Koitian could discuss the Yanchik Dembasagro, Kogilaya, this Kuyampuno, your Bambana, Yanko, exiting oil, Yanko, Kasur, Kuyampu number 10 Jongres.
This is one of the reasons that it's very rare that you might have something that is totally environmentally influenced or totally gene influenced. It's a combination of the two.
That is Tabalaya de Kasangasula, Rizichang Big, Shushan Koi Champi, Shijet Big, and in the Tant in the Hachan Yuati, Jensenteris, that dilated Asuga, Nerizitan, Koi, Nigushan Teco, Yam to take yours.
Reproduction is going to be very important because no gene is going to be passed on to the offspring if there are no offspring. And the more different types of genes there are in a population, the more likely we would have a gene that would do really well in a certain environment. And you learned in biology about dominant and recessive genes, ones that if it's present masks the other, and recessive where you need both recessives in order to see it.
Sechiga Rizisana, Tanda, and Sechiga Riziti, Yopayambana, Rizigenda, Nambatita, Mongichko, Maro, Kuron Riziting, one Pazo de Yokshagiora, and Sechunga Rizimbane, Sechunga Riziti, Chanamting, Moyalaya, Sechunga Rizigenda, Kunda, which Tanyam Chilita, Monguyores.
So there's definitely an evolutionary advantage to being able to have genes modify behaviors, but let's talk about how that's done. We still, with the science that we have right now, have no idea how genes control very complex behaviors. But we have examples that show us that that is the case. There are studies looking at lots of twins and the types of behaviors that have been inherited, but I'm just going to focus on two right now because it's easier to sort of see those things. But know that there are lots of twins that have been studied where we see these complex behaviors shared.
tanda chige bana ga so ta sema yora sema khorani ga paro ge chi chu tan ta tina do ge chi takshi shimji tina pe ma pu yore sim bana tina ga so ge de sema chi la ta de te wa sema ko punje de pison de la ta de te ane ko su ge paro la ya chi chi tan tan dap tan tan ane khapat ta nyongzon chengge wa nyongzon chengge de ka sa shi chu chi ro shi chu de tamong to yo paro wa o de ngu de pison chi ta gens.
These two twin brothers, Jim Lewis and Jim Springer, are identical twins, so they share the same genes, but they were separated at the age of 1 month and raised in different families.
Ta de la ya ko chemach to wa Jim Lewis and Jim Springer la Quran chai bana ta nga chu chema cha chung chema res cha chung chema system bala ya Quran chai ge rizhi chi pa chi cha res ra ta Quran do cheno je la ya lu chi la son system bala ya ane Quran khakha cha de te lu chi mas dawa chi la son bi kap se khakha cha de te ko tong che man ro la chong chong ba res.
They didn't see each other again until they were 39 years old.
Ta Quran ne shinko rel ta khatenu ko jila yang che thu system bala ya ne lu Quran lu sum sogol le de res.
They both experienced tension headaches. They both bit their nails. They both smoked the same brand of cigarettes. They both drove the same type of car. They vacationed in the same beach in another state. And they both named their sons James Allen.
That is the Quran shall tamong te mampu yore tigane ane khachi bana Quran tension had kilana chunung guzer sanga chung guzer ba ka shila chung gu chi zirgo chu ge chi za chi wa o te Quran shall do stem se ne simula su de che ane Quran ge thama thaya Quran ge thama ka chong ta chi pa yo chu ge thama thaya che ane long Korean chi pa ko che ane Quran ta da Florida ge chundam te da constant rosa ge chundam ya chi pa che tina se Quran che ge pugmila ro pugmila ya mi James Allen chi pa ta sa yo res.
Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that because they shared the same genes, they named their son James Allen.
That under this is Quran shall exist by in some Quran Susu Pugmila Jam Allen Tagaris.
But there are some remarkable similarities in some very complex behaviors for two people who developed in very different places from the age of 1 month.
That under the co Dawachini and co Korean Mandawala Roa, Chineta Mandawala, Serlon Chonyi, Kuraniga Parolaya, and a Chigunza Chengi, Shisholaya, and a Chico Chongchat and Timbicharwa, Europa Ditangis.
Now, I want you to put on your scientific thinking caps. So you are scientists, you have been trained in some of this science pedagogy and some of the science thinking. What's a problem with this if we're talking about the genes and the behaviors and how they're connected?
Tanda Chisugarwa, Matsuge, a lottery parade, Sari parade, that Toxichiare, Tinado Gichiga, Tamishiti Combainas, that is Sari Pajimbi wants some Latambainas, Ruata, some Latanto Tinado Chiba in Baina. De la yang acu rizeta shisho kola indewa cita keduas. De la ya kange karitus, shong karitus de la.
Seems like that one of the conditions don't affect gene expression.
Sorry, say again?
It seems like there was sense. It seems like even though different development doesn't affect gene expression.
The different
They have a different
environment, okay.
Different environment, it seems like that doesn't affect the gene expression.
Okay, yes, but what might be the issue with what we're looking at that might make that not the case?
Dada dim bana gelaso ate Quran chege tanda dus taba bana kola chungwi chachi mabuchi tamas tambalaya ne Quran je khori mandawa chalon chong bai bana la khori mandawa chalon chong ba tegi khori tegi sichola ya suche tegi mas rawchi dus.
In other words, what could explain some of these things without genes being what is causing these things.
Tai mai na ya ko de la ya dire ro system bal to ko le chechung ka sing tu score ta de na na ko ngoto che te ka sro da picha sha pai na the thama gila to te nga su rigzi la ke chama she pai na rigzi la ke chama she pai na chu tang gi chu ro chu tang gi ro rigzi la yan de ma ta pa chi de ta ma chi pai na chu dire ro te ba de chu kale te ne chung go saris.
Or what are some things that might be similar about the environments for these twins, even though they're very different cities from 1 month to age 39?
Imba na ko ya cha chen ta tin chen se ko da jen da khari ge shu chen te yo sparis ko da wa shi mo ne ane ko ki tron chen ma do ne le salon chong ro ko on de
ye jina tan da din lo la smoke thama de chikba jingya ji tungda ta di so de kurangi ga gi towa ji ra thama gi towa ta chikba ga di ko gi nilem ba din yo receptor receptor chikba yo di ta rigzi gi kembe ni di gi wangi ta receptor chikba yo ngoro chajan towa di la mi se gi ni gala di kurso shugen chembo yo sonda ni ga gi di la ga uchi gi res
in kene sonda de he say because they smoke the same brand of cigarette because he's saying that because they have similar same genes and they may have the same receptors to feel the same taste of the cigarette or the same smell of the cigarette.
That would be a way to explain that the genes are affecting these behaviors. But let's say the genes are not affecting these behaviors.
That
What's another way we could explain what we're seeing here without the genes being what affects the behavior?
Pamegi Odigi
the behavior of the parents maybe is not because of the gene, but it could be the behavior of the parents. It was the behavior of the parents was passed down to them.
Behavior of the patterns was passed down to them.
Oh, Yamana Tuadus
Explain a little bit more.
Konzugi Pap Tanda Konzuni Komshi Komshi Dida Pame Komshi Tumba Yungore, Tumba Yore. So
Pama Senada Gasubo
Kurani Pama Yora. Pamani Dila any Motage Dinde Taya Gao Tama Dinde Tunge Yoda Dinde Chikbayona.
And that pieces and a Kurani Pamasana Kurani
Pamamunit.
Yeah. He has a follow-up question. Do they, the twins, have similar behaviors you have mentioned over here with their birth parents?
I don't know what their birth parents did in terms of smoking and tension headaches and nail biting, so I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, he's saying that because I asked that question because in the epigenetics this kind of effect happens.
Yeah. So think about epigenetics and think about how you might explain some of this with epigenetics.
Epigenetics o ti ko la samna tang de tan de la yende se kanda jasares pasa
Kuni dawa chini ta
kaka charwa
charwa ta mitsang roji na mitsang ni pa kinjo ando ina kuni kuni ti kinjo ge mitsang ni pansen ro shik chumo yona men se te te na ti shik kenga ta na pu ro na min chi kwa ta ya ro yong se ro kuni ma ti na ya kuni san long chong sa gen de ko mitsang sho ro kuni pansen ro shik chumo yona ti wang ge yang
his concern over here is because even though they didn't meet until they're 39 years old, the families, two families, they raised them from 1 month.
Right.
The families may have connections.
They didn't. The families didn't have connections between the two of them. So, oh, go ahead.
National Gala Dani Gania, Kuyu does natural selection, Madame Bayina, Danda, Changi the Kingi does Dejushavala, Denequa, Amjo Mas Hayashungua, the Rizumia, the Nikki Shiri or Marwa, and Co Papa Nati Yuan Dea, Co chilling in the coding and do only Damia the show, the lady war, but then Rick Chan the Pege, when you drive the young civic charge does.
His answer is, as you have mentioned in the example of the fox, some genes are expressed because other genes are selected.
Okay.
That might be the case in this case.
But that would still be the genes because they're going to have them in the same place on the chromosome for both brothers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Gilagis on the Rizita Mandel gonna China Segurita.
Taduzo tanda di ene ko modano ena ko ya twen di chudi sajan niga lo chigba ro che na yin chau ro che yang keda chimo ro chaba na yang di chane yang kuzo yang tang ya gin do ba yang ya da tuzo yara a din yong cho salis.
His answer is that the cars or the cigarette, maybe the popularity of the cigarette and the types of car during their times. So if the cars or cigarette are famous during the time, they may have chosen that one for them. Yeah.
And so that might be a reason, or maybe they're advertised really well, even though they're in different cities in that state, in that region, and so more people are buying those. So that would be something we need to test to see. What are some other things that might be environmental influences that could explain some of these things?
Della Tegi, Koi Kitchen Segurata, Shenda Caridusa.
Dirivchik Poser Nindora, Tikuchigajita, Jacondo, Pache Tanyo Injera. That the Dingala Shichu and Dorado Kiamata, Manda Mobuchigara. That Dikuchia, the Koricha. Then Jitan the Damson Yote, Takia and Dojio, Chason Dagmara. Dajozo Kiamanda, and the Takia.
Because of the same era or the same age, and people may have similarities between the behaviors, and we have only chosen several similar behaviors, but we may have lots of dissimilar behaviors. So that may be because of they just raise up in the same, even though there's like different cities in one state, but because of the same age and raised up in the same era, they may have some similar behaviors.
Yes, that's good. My favorite color is blue. How many of you like blue? Maybe it's our genes. So if we're looking for the similarities, there might be lots of differences, and just because we found these certain similarities doesn't necessarily mean that that is because of the genes. So you want to be really careful when you hear an example like this to think about what are the influences that might make this seem like they're connected, and how could we test to see if they really are.
That didn't know Stabalaya, and a Zabzachi that Delaya, and Delaya coach Soncha Mampuchi, Tungores, Soncha Mapuchi Tungure, the Yimbanaya coach, Soncha de Tata, Duma to Siguro, Tandig, Japchisan is Amatan, that Soncha de Tamba de 총찬 딜레텐데 야 코란이게 릭지기 시에레사도 코기 시에레스 대화치 타양 거와 대화 딱 이에바데 타타 렌두문두 세땡 아수게 딱 고요레스 텔레 삼라땅 고요레스.
And one of those came up. Somebody said, well, what about their parents? Do their parents have that?
that tanda dinero ge tuatile sonsne kusugu pama yoro koran shini ge pama la ya dinero yoro is ke chat sons.
Now, it might just be a mix of the parents' genes that led to something if it is genetic, but if the parents had it and the offspring had it, that might give you a better indication that maybe this is doing something.
That ya chichi bana pama ni chege reason debalatene de tero reason debalatene ya student no yong baya yang sebaris. Ya chichi bana ya pama la ya pama ya dinero sipachi che puila dinero sipachi system bala ya reason ni ya sa chiwarwa oten de se jaga yong goris.
And what about when these brothers were inside the mother? Is that an environment?
That and the Putin Shako Pamage Penunane, that or Pamatokan Penunane, could Salon Capse, Salon Sagiti, Corrigies.
And the first month of their life, they were in the same place, in the same environment. So there may be some environmental influences early in their development that affected what happened later.
That and the Tanoko Chinu Jela, Dawachisa, Pamayamchila Debarwa. Chichina Tigi Corrigitin on a Yopigi, Gent Latin Dete, Tigi Shushentine, Kogeta, Chambuch Hostamba, Yong Batina,
It's still a remarkable example, but we want to be critical and really think through what does this really mean and how could we test what seems like a connection.
That didn't know by now, Koge, Pitch and the Tongue, the Yansambutan Casagre, then she was sure in by now, didn't know Chita, Yimber now was a same system, but Yimber now again, Joach or the Tola Yang Asugi Tako, the Shomapula Tande Tako, Taxechi Guyores.
And by controlling an experiment well, we can make sure that it's not this influence or that influence or that influence.
Tanga suga taxi capseta ko tangzin rukoyor tangzin che tangzin tingi chinchi de aleni dola de jun dilatende de chinchon de chonate marsha se jun de dilatende suchen de choya marsha se ti taxete chiguyores.
That's why if you do an experiment, and certainly if you teach your fellow monks and nuns about experiments, you should very much be careful to make sure that they understand how we need to control things in experiments.
That the Chesu Taxia Je Malaya, Chesu Taxi Cordu Tripicus in Bana Chesu Nibert, and a Taxi Tripicus, Karichi Tanzanchi Machichurwa, Tipeti Taco, Kase Gusegun Koran de Shijaguyores.
And just because we see a connection, not automatically assume, oh, these things are tied together.
Nasuchin Dewachi Tombatan Lamsankro Alan Shaladan Dewash Tambushu Chindu set in the Layo Maris.
We know from lots of experiments on many different twins that genes can influence how religious a person is, their intelligence, their social attitudes, their psychological dispositions, and lots of other traits.
That and that Semagrala Tashiwa Telatere de Tandanga Rizzi, Tishkin to Tisachorwa, meeting that's Hemati, Namsho Kananochido, Kosuga Chute Kananochiresha, Nesta Sola Tatangananochidu, Sam Konga Niba Kananochidu, Lasso Palaya, and the Shushan to Cures.
But that is influence and not cause.
That they Shushan to go or Matope, Juchio Mares.
Oops. So epigenetics was mentioned earlier by one of you in the class, and this is the idea that traits are heritable but not caused by changes in the DNA sequence.
That reason they related against Gongola Sons. Reason there is not Casagor, Junzent Kuyores, the Cheshire. Cheshite Junzent Kuyorda Imana Junzent to Pig Cheshite, a DNA Kurungo Kurum Chorala, Tel and Juatani, Juan my batches gores.
The idea of Lamarck was that organisms could acquire a characteristic in their life and pass it on to their offspring.
다 lemra ku kurang ge tanda junjung ge tatsu chura lemra lu ku kurang ge junjung ge tatsu ka so gre system bala singu ching ba na singu ti la ya chisu ku la ya chechu chi chong chong ge chechu ching ba ku la ya chisu chechu chi chong ba de ku ge ma re rab ji ma la jure chi tik su gores.
So for instance, a blacksmith that is pounding metal into shapes builds up strong muscles and then could potentially pass that on to his offspring.
Ta tanda de ka su ku pitsun chi ka sha gores dan garwa ge pitsun sha gores dan garwa ku ge chigte dong stan bala chig dong stan bala ku ge ta de lakpa ge de ge shadum tu pe shane pe chambu sha gorwa chambu chaba ge chechu te kurang ge rab jimal jitu chit kirsi dashite ja gores.
This idea was before we really understood natural selection and has been largely discounted for all kinds of different traits.
Da ngomai banar wa tanda ge samna tang tang de baina ku ka sugre tang su ge rangshon dam ri chigor wa te ge tawa ge ngol chong bata ani ku junong po chila ya ani ku kar sati ko na me tang sa ju de du ga himba ne ngoya ti chechu mam po china ngong yores.
But there are a very few examples where we've actually found that something that happens to the parents can affect their offspring through genetics.
Ta da nga su ri ri pala tene de ti wa phama la chong wa chike ane phama la chong sha ba chike ane pgi la ya shikshin to thku yo pate ane tanda ri ji ri pa na ne dus nye thiores.
One of these experiments was with rats, and they looked at if we take away the pups, then the pups will emit a sound that makes the mom come and bring them back if they're not in the nest where they're supposed to be.
De tanda ge takshe chi ka tsu kan la de yore tsu kan la system bala ka chi gore system bala da tsu thik tin da yora thuk tin da yora tsu te ane phama ge sane dus pha ke bai bai na phama ta tsu ge ti ku ke chi ja gare sta ke ja ba tla tin de te ane phama ge khorong ge tsu thik te su su ge chang na me ba ha ku ro ha ku ta ane ta tsu ge ama de song yang ku tsu ge de chu lan de te yang shi su chang na kyong gu yore ke chi ja gare.
When they return, the mother licks them more.
Da tanda de ko ge zge de yang shi su su ge zge de su su ge chang na so khen chanu je la ya ama de ge su su ge bu ge de la ya da ko ji da mas ji ge yores.
And rats that experience this tend to have higher levels of stress and anxiety and pass that on to offspring.
Da tira do chi ge ko zge de ba ba na ko la ya nga su de sanlam chi ro non shi chi ro stress ro de ko rang ge che de thua yo ba che thua yo pe me se ko rang ge yang ko zge la ro ko ge bu ge la yang man ko je ton chi ge yores.
This is a very unusual example. There are not many examples of this type of thing at all, but now we know there are a few exceptions.
Ta tanda dire ro patient ma po yo maris ha chon nyo re simba na ya tanda nga su ta patient dile tende ta nga su kare ha ku yo re system bala ya ane tanda chingu ge na ne ro dig kaps ane mukse gi yang ko ni tang tenda yo pa te nga su tanda ha ku yo res.
There is nuclear DNA and mitochondrial DNA. So the nuclear DNA is the DNA that we typically think of, that's inside the nucleus.
Ta de la yang su ge DNA la ke je she ba ba na DNA ani yo res ta ri ni su ko da ni sa ni si te nga su ge tha phung ge tin yang na yo ro tin yang na yo pa te tanda tin yang na yo pe ge DNA ta shen de nga su ge ro mitochondrial stambala ni che wan thya ro ni che wan thak na yo ya DNA yo res.
The mitochondrial DNA can be passed down directly from the mother to their offspring via the mother's egg, and these are easier for the DNA to be modified in because they're not selected for.
Ahanda tanda dege ngasuge kasa nichu wantana na yo pig DNA chigoro de ne amage khamre de ta pugila ya dus juto chitku yores ro junzet le juto chitku yores ta de ko ngasuge chikola ya jwa tango na jwa ta le law yores ne shenda kasa de damdrichi magu gan ko shajala ya ti kasa jwa tana tang le law yores
as strongly as that nuclear DNA.
That tanda karsa ngasuge the ninde nona yo pig den to druba imbana lilo yorskwa.
So there's this idea of functionalism, looking at a behavior for what it does for the animal.
That tanda ya ko jelly chorwa jelly so ma we say chores jelly so ma functionalism sigdwa jelly ti so ma diga sugur system balaya digi khari se gore sena ko ge shichu chik tengorwa shichu ti tembala tene de ane singu tela khari chik du say choro ti se yores.
So why do songbirds sing in the spring?
That tanda chi ngachu chiu ge ke jani choro ata shetane chiu ku chugi chika kharchine shetang yores. Looking for mate?
Yeah, they can use it to look for a mate. So the functional benefit of that behavior is being able to find a mate.
That de kapse korangi kasugureta cheli tandevi what the functional says the cheli tandevi kependika system balada kogeta daudzetrwa.
We can acquire language, and that helps us to be able to survive and also perhaps to find a mate.
That ngaso la ya ne kei chi thobaya gi nibati yorwa telatne de kei thoba telatne de chine ngasuge kasugre chuni chit khata anine ngasuge ta ya susug daudze thage ne ta te gorwas.
Obviously not in your cases.
Da chesuge ne ta te mares.
We have two different types of ways we can explain behaviors that we see. Distal and proximate.
Distal and proximal.
Distal explains it from an evolutionary standpoint. How did this evolve over time? Or do I see this in animals that are closely related to each other evolutionarily? And why might this have been selected for? Proximate explanations talk about mechanisms. So how did this come about? So what would be a distal reason that the songbird sings? Okay, it might be related evolutionarily to a bunch of other birds that sing. An approximate explanation might be it has these structures inside the brain that allow it to be able to learn and produce song.
ta ni ni ge ko research ka research tambala ya chi che ba na le pa ko chu ti ge le pa na la ya ne ko she tang ya la ya phe bi ge le pa ge chakko te use bar was
그럼 고리우 동대로
What's the question?
그런 지분에 대해서 또 지분에 있으면 그런 로봇 스케이트한 거 시당시 지분이 그런 지분에 대해서 아니 나 지분에 대해서 그런 로봇 거다 로봇이 스케이트한 거 시당시
tate kare ni ni ge deshere jang de deshere
저 릭제던데 게 말이야 그런 고리우 tung 거다
okay maybe the bird is lonely and the bird is calling for his friends come out
Maybe. We could test that, right? We could see if he calls, do other friends, other birds come to him or not?
한테 가서 탁세 지난 디기로 와서 그 시탄스 담발라 그 록파스 연구 너무 더 다나 디기로 와서 탁세 지난 디기레스
Sometimes a behavior that we see might not have a function.
다 지치브냐 참참라야 가지고 통하게 시쇼지요 와가서 통하게 시쇼들라야 그 젤리 메바 되나야 연습하레스
It might have had a function previously and it still remains, but it doesn't serve a purpose in the species or the individual where you see it.
다야 그 단다게 니르 되게 나라야 단다게 니르 되게 나 제수게 지금 거기 가서 지 통화제와 이번에 그 시주지 통받을 시주들라야 셀리 매바지 이번에 그거 지금 랍디스야 때바 이번에 랍디 값을 그 시주에 요바지 셀리양 요바서 걸어와다 이번에 단다 통화에 때 값을 그 시주때 요다야 셀리 매바들로 요버그레스
One example of this is in infant humans, they have a grasping reflex with their feet and with their hands really early in life when they are first born.
다 대가라 나가 부기 땅포치 바이바나 그게 땅포치 비가서 그 번지지하게 동거지 그래서 부기 청소라 내가 그 번지지 동거도 그 락바타 깜반 인샤게 두슨 지 그래서
Over a short period of time, they lose that.
다 통통치가 안에 단대가 동거대 라두고 그래서
And the best stimulus to express that grasping is if you have a clump of hair near their hand.
다 때나도 그런 게 따지고 철롱치야지 그러 젠롱치야게 젠티가레스 담발아야 다 침부지고 바나 It's thought
that maybe this is left over from genes that were selected for in other primates that are closely related to us, so that that infant would grab the hair and be able to hang on as the mom moved around.
지치 반반가 속에 다데 가서 토름 소차가 당가 속에 토름 소차나 가서도 마보 여러 센터 여러 틴다도게 리지게 술하지고 와 술하바 틴다도 인스바레스 나 고마이 바나 코서 더 비우다 틴다도 톰바나 코 빌라 투바탄 람사 타마가 방고가 저친 로고 여러 아마두스타발라 오 틴다도 야 게 리지게 따티게 시첸테 술하바 틴다도 인스바레스
We don't have that hair, so it doesn't serve a purpose in humans, but it was probably strongly selected for, and it still remains.
당가 술라야 장고나 프메스 담발라 군 주시게 되게 내탄데 용아요 말와 디캅스 바나 코게 다제 코 젤리 스고라 다 젤리 다다 요 말와 레 말에 임바이나양 코게 다 당가 수그 투름 소처가 나라야 디베트 크로 가서 그랬대 댐드기치야 시기 첨부 여자 And
as I mentioned before with the foxes, some traits that we see are side effects of natural selection for other traits. Some traits might just result from chance,
다 야 제시 같이 임바이나 야그 가서 그래 대왕 그 종아되나 요레스
I don't know. Whenever you touched it, stopped it working. It's okay. It's okay. There we go. And we may have evolved mechanisms for certain behaviors that don't deal with every situation where they're expressed. So sweating may be very functional when you have to regulate your temperature, but when you're taking an exam and you sweat, it may not serve a whole lot of function for you.
다 단다게 레츠 코데시시라 레츠티 펜주 종하게 레츠치 요레 레츠 요파임바나 레츠티게 네타치 데시자고 임바나야 레츠티게 네타 치 아니가 갑 카티 임바나 데시자가 데나도 용고요 마리스 피차샤파나 가수 ngurotom batero ngurotom bate nguchitom baina ngurotom batiki chelika resistam bala gasu zupu trosete tangjanchi guyorwa remare imbainaya tachiranga jikto tabi kapsa jikto tangasa jikto tri kasa ngurotom de paimbana tigi cheliti kurang kasugre ta tatatra masongas dukuyo maris ti kapsa yang ko ngurotom bigi litsu chigoro dese chigoro ati kapten telen jikumaris.
We can look at natural selection to understand the behaviors that we see in certain species.
다 단다 가수게 karsa ti rangshon dendu peche tanga de te ani chi ni cheng na na yo pigi ani kusula shishu chepo atinda yorwa otinda do decision kores.
This cat here is the former cat of Andy Kazama, who some of you know.
Tanda de do Andy ge
His cat Sam.
ko shimi de mena sam chen de gelang asu Andy Kazama ge shimi res.
But learning can be part of a species typical behavior. So being able to learn might be something that species has in its array of genes that help it to function.
ta chichibai na ta chichibai ta nga chuge sijong sai chura sijong sai te ya ni sito pach kana la ya ne kurang chunni ge chet guya ge ani chi kasugre sichog na la yo patina ro ingres ta ya ko.
Similarly with biological preparedness.
Te na shinge tanda de ko lojon chia tir do lojon chia te yang ko ni la ya sita ko chechu ge tuma mai beres te na shinge nga suge dilpu thani bana tradichia shiora tradichi de chgoro te res.
So there have been experiments done on primates that show if there's a snake structure that they see, like a fake rubber snake, that they'll respond to it, even if they've never seen a snake before.
Tanda de la nga su chitu sochana la ya taksi tenda drio res picha shapana nga su dru zu ta tan jik dru tenda nu sha pa bana lamsang kro che phaj gorwa o te ge chung res ta te chitu sochana des tamala taksi chisa te ge ngonche dru thom manyong ba bana la chig yores.
You could understand how that could be very important in making sure that an animal might survive.
Nangata tanda dile tene de primary chisu ge chingwe khorang ro da socha khorang chuni chia la ya ka chu ke chambo imbade de thong dos.
But even species typical behavior is relative because environment plays a role.
Ta tanda ya ko niru chila ya thamen to yopi niru chike thmo mai be shichu imba na ya ko 거기 거기라 라리기요레스.
A primate that might be afraid of a rubber snake, you might introduce it to a rubber snake over time. It has no ill effects. It might get used to it and then not really respond anymore.
하다 제토게 소사치러와 단다 체랑게 지키 드치탄 바이바나 담보다 셰거 또 텐션 바이나 콤치 담atelaya 지키 드치탄스나 야미시르와스 코티스탄발aya 티게 양 콘주라타 두요레스.
단다 이 디와직 쇼치와시 단다티 보모 가시 직도와 지키 제루 제단 딘조 고 부기 제루 제단 고 타고타게 지기도와 부기 제루 제단 가와체 다는 신기 부카시 직 보모기 제레를 베 가오체 베 도당이나 계제 시당이나 돌로 권당이나 베 보문나시 제를 가오체기도와 딘조 리지기 개발 기레면도와 티 컨디스 용구에나스
리지 개발 리지가
the condition you going to
yeah, behaviors. When we talk about the behavior, we see some men act like women and some women act like men. Is that because what is causing that behavior expression?
So we don't know all of the mechanisms that might lead to that. One of the things that you can think about and might have some influence is what happens inside the mom in terms of the hormones like testosterone and estrogen that the developing fetus is exposed to.
That singames in Bainaya, they got some Balaya, that Puguti Amagin on a Yopi Capsa. Aninga sugeta menzigiri or menzigiri tanda karsata potamugi menzichi or wata or tigi ane monglo chetenchi machila sopagi chente pachila yang samtona degrees.
There may also be some genes that influence that together.
Chiche bana tela ya chi yanko rizigi yanko tamungo chento batina yopres.
People are still trying to study that to find out.
That the colaya, the Karichini by colaya, make it ando in Banayanko, Taxi de Lenti Segioris.
If we look across species, we have two different types of possibilities when we see a similar behavior.
Mahanda dananga suge yang ko nyir manda ogana la dus taba imbaina nga suge kasugre da chi koge shichu chigorwa shichu ti dawu tengi yopagi ta chi deshe jata manda ni yores.
One is homology or common ancestry.
Chikare says tambala content says tambala ya tamongu mebu yoba.
And the other is analogy or similarity between these because they've been selected to be able to do the same thing.
Shendachi says tambala nga sugi chetan re sepa tambarwa sheli tambaterwa nes tambala ko penju chongwe kapsu na ko lika chipa chi drag chetu ane damdi chiwares.
So this ladybug is not going to be sharing a lot of the genes as the bat and the owl, but they all fly.
Tandela bushta tam bujamu ina karina bushto data ani de gala yochuge de tsukam bushto data de gala yochuge upashto ani bana kosuge chirizila tabaim bana rizi chitamongo rizi mabushra yomares.
This is an example of the analogy or convergent evolution where there's a big advantage to these being able to fly, but they're not closely related in terms of their genes.
That dikare na gatsuki chetan la sto sheli thamba gango gone chajure sheli thamba dikala na chisong penjur sa sto chisong penjur ge tane chungores ta de kutsu dinadu chora matope kutsu parula ya rigzig de oyo mares.
Now if we're talking about different species of owls, then that would be homology because it would be due to the common ancestry of a previous bird that was before those two owls.
Ahanda tanda te ketinga sugaya upag nanaya upanyiru mando yora upanyiru mando nane keche shepe kapsembana dinga suga tampo content se terale grace kuchu mibu chine dus chejung gorwa ko rizitande yora tis tambale content gane keche she grace.
If the last common ancestor had wings, then those species that came after it having wings would be homology. And if the last common ancestor did not have wings, like in the case of the insect and the owl, that would be analogy.
Da ngasu deko dana dela ya content ta chen se ge deko iwa chia de ne thamong miu thama tirwa thamong miu thama dela ya ane kete shoba yo pai ba na ro da ko su ta samchin ju ta ko ro thamong miu thama dela shoba yo pai ba na ko content chagres thamong miu thama dela ya ne shoba me pai ba na ta ne tan dela shishana se gorda ane ko su ka chagres ne shente chagres.
So hearing about these different types of behaviors and the different ways that they may have evolved and the influences of genetics and the environment, after the tea break, we're going to talk a little bit about how these influences can affect the nervous system.
Mahanda danda dela nga suge mampuchi ta yora nga suge rigzire khogila sopa ge shishuk la kana shuchen te ge yo me la ya ane nga su tudon chi chi twatren dus chi yora mampuchi na res ta this tambala ya soche person ge je la ya tanda shechu deta ngone roa ane nga suge ta wansa mala su ro da wansa la ya pha la ya ni shuchen kari te ge me te ta ge yens.
And some of those differences in the nervous system are then going to affect the behaviors that we see.
Ta wansa mala na la ya khoge shuchen te pa te la tene de te ane nga suge shisho la ya ko chapatang yores.
So we'll see you after the tea break.
Soche person jine jayons.